In the last part of Singer's essay, he's concerned to argue against the assumption or the position, which is very common, he believes, and he claims, and he argues, the position that's very common that says that humans deserve some special consideration, that humans ought to be counted as more valuable or more worthy of ethical consideration than organisms in other species. So again, the thesis of the essay is all animals are equal, or all animals ought to be treated equally, ought to be given equal moral consideration. And so any position that thinks humans ought to be given special moral consideration over animals is contrary to his position, and that's what he's arguing against. So he labels the view that humans deserve some special moral consideration as speciesism, and he compares that to the more well-known positions of racism and sexism. He thinks speciesism is just as arbitrary, and it's based on just as bad arguments. I mean, when people try to justify their speciesism, they justify it based on claims about the human species that aren't true for all members of the human species. Okay, so, and we'll see more, and if whatever claims are true about all members of the human species are also true about some members of non-human species. So there's no relevant distinction between humans and non-human animals, and that means that humans ought to be given some special consideration. So Singer first argues that most humans are speciesist, and he gives some very colorful examples of this. Most humans eat meat from animals that have been killed for that purpose. So, some humans have to kill the animals and others eat the meat from the animals. That practice alone suggests that humans think that other animals aren't as important as themselves. Most humans are not cannibals, for instance. They don't eat human meat. They don't kill other humans and eat them, but they do kill non-human animals and eat them. How animals are bred and managed before the killing and the eating shows a tremendous lack of concern for the animal's welfare, for the animal's pain and suffering and frustration and all kinds of other negative experiences, pain broadly construed. Very little consideration for that. And so if you think about, what would it be like if humans treated other humans the way that they treat animals in factory farms? It's horrific. It's a horrific, thing to imagine. So clearly, this is evidence of speciesism as well. And all of the experiments that are done on animals, people would be it's not currently legal to do those kinds of experiments on human subjects, but researchers do them on animals all the time. They essentially poison dozens or hundreds of mice as part of an experiment, and half of the mice may die. Half of them may suffer, may be seriously deformed. There are, genetic modification experiments with mice. So there's a tremendous amount of animal experimentation that doesn't seem to show equal moral consideration for the animals, as would be shown to humans. The argument that Singer leaves us with at the end of the paper is an argument that there's no difference between all humans and all non-human animals that justifies our speciesism. When people try to justify, when they try to say why it is humans should be given special moral consideration, none of the answers that they give are convincing, because this is Singer's argument. I'm not saying you have to agree with it, but I'm just reporting on Singer's argument. He says none of those reasons is convincing, because for each putative difference between humans and non-human animals, like for instance intelligence, level of intelligence or awareness, there are cases of some animals who exhibit more of this trait than some humans. For instance, a dog that responds to 15 different commands and can communicate when it wants to eat or when it wants to go outside can do more communication with other humans, can do more language than an infant who was just born. So if intelligence is the criterion, or if ability to talk is the criterion, then we ought to, in those cases, preserve the dog and let an infant die. Likewise about many mentally handicapped humans. They wouldn't be able to, there are some mentally handicapped humans who can't converse even at the level that a dog who can respond to 15 commands or a horse who can respond to 15 commands can converse. And likewise about intelligence or awareness or so on. Okay, so Singer wants to conclude from this that drawing the line of ethical consideration at human versus non-human is arbitrary and unjustified. We need rather to draw it at the line of what can suffer, what can feel pain and pleasure, at sentience, as he calls it. And so Singer's position is pretty clearly an instance of what we've earlier called sentiocentrism, the view that that the focus of our moral consideration ought to be sentience, the feeling of pleasure and pain, and that includes the pain and pleasure of both humans and non-human animals. So at this point, again, I'd like to invite you to ask yourself whether you agree or disagree with Singer's views about this. You may agree with some parts of it, but not with others. If you don't have any good reasons to disagree with him, then you should follow his recommendations and become vegetarian and start to respect the needs of animals much more. So if you think there's something wrong with it, you really should say and try to figure out what you think about it, because it's a pretty important. If Singer is right about this, it's pretty important, and a lot of us are involved in some pretty immoral stuff. If he's right about this. If you disagree with him, say, again, if you disagree, say why. So some people have really, I mentioned at the beginning of these videos that Singer is very controversial, and when he gives talks, those talks are often protested. And one of the major motives for that is Singer's claim that in some cases, a cow that's suffering deserves more moral consideration. Should be saved. The life of the cow should be saved. The cow should be taken care of, even if it means that, say, a human infant would have to die. So take a human infant who is, through some kind of birth problem, is lacking a brain. Okay, and the human infant could be kept alive, but that requires resources that, if you use those resources, you won't be able to keep a cow alive, a cow that is, fully healthy, and so on. So Singer's argument would be, well, the cow is more capable of feeling pleasure and pain than this infant without a brain is, and so we should let the infant die and we should save the cow. And the idea that we should ever save an animal and let a human die, or kill a human in order to save an animal, is extremely offensive to a lot of people, because a lot of people, they, perhaps understandably, they care a lot about protecting human life and recognizing the value of human life, and they don't want to accept any compromises on that. And it seems like Singer is somehow challenging that. And so, again, he ends up being very controversial. So I invite you to think critically as you want to, and from as critically as you can, and from as many angles as you can, and think about, what is potentially wrong with this, and do you agree or disagree with it? What parts of it do you agree or disagree with?